Hi there, Dr. Paul Firnhaber here at Lincoln Disc and Nutrition Center, and it's time for 10 Minutes of Truth because it's Wednesday. So we've been going through a book called Lies I Taught in Medical School, and we're sort of going through each chapter and talking about some of the lies that our society believes and he actually taught as a medical school professor. So we're going to cover another two of them today. Chapter 7 is called the cardiovascular lie. And here's the lie that he says that he believed and he taught. Statins are a good choice to prevent heart disease. He completely obliterates the idea that statins are helpful. And in fact, he says that statins have a tremendous amount of side effects. And that when you really look at the studies on statins with the control group and the group taking the statin medication, there's only a 1.1% difference in the amount of people that actually got heart disease. So statins were about 1.1% effective. Not very good. I mean, most people would not buy something that was only 1.1% better than not having it at all. And yet that's what he says about statins. He talked about how the pharmaceutical industry, when they write a report or a study up on the side effects of statins, how they categorize them in all kinds of little categories to make it look like there aren't nearly as many side effects as people think there might be. But he said, added together, however, these pathologies become substantial, showing how dangerous statins are to one's muscles. So then he talked about the types of cholesterol, and he says LDL cholesterol is really not that big, not as big of a deal as we've been led to believe that it is. He says you have to look at the size of the LDL particles, which I've talked about in other Wednesday talks. There's big LDL particles and small ones. The big ones don't hurt you. It's the small, dense LDL particles that really cause heart disease. He says, however, it turns out that statins miss the small, dense LDL cholesterol, and that small LDL cholesterol levels are increased by carbohydrates in the diet. So eating too much refined carbohydrate increases the small LDL particles, which is what ultimately leads to heart disease. And the statins don't really do much of anything with those, which it helps you understand why there's only a 1.1% difference in the people that have heart disease, that die of heart attacks without cholesterol and that die with taking the statins. The last thing he says 2/3 of the people admitted to the hospital with heart attacks have metabolic syndrome, which is high blood sugar, high blood pressure, high lipids, cholesterol and triglycerides, and usually overweight. He says they have metabolic syndrome despite having normal cholesterol levels. For this reason, he questions whether cholesterol is a culprit. So it's actually high triglycerides and not necessarily high cholesterol. So his solution is to get carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates out of the diet and exercise, and that's really going to help with the whole cholesterol heart disease issue. So chapter 8 is the cancer lie. Now here's the lie. Most cancer is caused by accumulated DNA damage, which causes abnormalities in the cells, which causes cancer to grow. And he says that is a complete lie. And he gives some good reasons. Now let's just go through this chapter. First of all, he makes some statements that I think are really important. After more than half a century of effort, we're no closer to significantly lowering the cancer death rate. So the traditional ways of treating cancer is what he calls slash, burn, and poison. In other words, you cut it out, you burn it out with radiation, or you poison it with chemotherapy. And this has not worked very well. He says the bad news is that the standard treatments only save about 4% of cancer patients. Meanwhile, the death rate from cancer has increased by about 9% since 1950. It's actually gone up. So then he talks about Dr. Otto Warburg's research in Germany in the 1930s, and where he discovered that cancer cells actually ferment sugar for their energy needs, and that is because of damaged mitochondria. So he says there's a real connection between metabolism and how metabolism isn't working properly and the whole cancer process. Now, he talks a lot about the genetic theory of cancer. He says in some cancers, there is some truth to that. He says, but the problem is that one of the theories is as we get older, our genes mutate, and that genetic mutation can cause cancer. He says, but if you look at animals, that isn't the case. He says some long-lived species, such as naked mole rats, certain bats, elephants, and blue whales, resist cancer, and they live a long time. He says the bowhead whales don't have any of what they call tumor suppressing genes, which some of these animals do, but they live over 200 years. So he says in other animals that are long-lived, they don't get cancer. So that isn't necessarily the issue. So what about the genetic theory of cancer, that genes cause cancer? Well, he brings up a very interesting experiment that I think you need to know about. And this experiment is where they took cancer cells that were dividing and that had cancer, and that were dividing and producing other cancer cells. And then they took normal cells, and they took the DNA and the genetic material out of the cancer cells and put it into the normal cells. And they took the genetic material out of the normal cells and put it into the cancer cells. And he says, what do you think happened? Well, the cells that originally had cancer stayed cancerous, and the cells that had no cancer, that were replaced with the genetic material of the cancer cells, they stayed cancer-free. So the problem wasn't in the genes. So his conclusion is that we have to minimize the cancer risk by changing our lifestyles and our diets. He said staying away from refined carbohydrates and seed oils, because they are the main drivers of insulin resistance, inflammation, and non-cancerous metabolic disease. Diabetes, heart disease, cancer. It's amazing how all these devastating conditions and diseases have close links to metabolic issues. And I would add one other thing to this that I think that he's left out that I think is important. I think another area of cancer to look at that I think is really important is the hormonal influences, like all the estrogen that we're exposed to in our culture. And we know that high levels of estrogen in women tend to cause breast cancer. And so looking at a hormonal model as well as a metabolic model might be a little bit more complete. But he does a very good job in this chapter on cancer. And he says, really, it's not necessarily about aging. And it's not necessarily about genetics. It's really about what kind of lifestyle do we lead? What kind of food do we eat? how much refined carbohydrate do we eat, how much do we exercise. Those are the things that actually play a more important role in whether we get cancer than whether we don't. So those are the next two chapters in his book. We're going to cover the Alzheimer's lie next week. So next week, I'm doing a talk in my office on Tuesday night called Chiropractic and Science.
29th.
It's the 29th, excuse me. We're doing that talk on the 29th. So we will see you then. See you on the 29th. And until then, I hope that you've enjoyed these 10 minutes of truth on Wednesday and going through the lies I taught in medical school. I think it's very interesting. And then once we're through this book, and we're going to get back to some of the individual articles on clinical nutrition and science that I usually go over on Wednesdays. So this is Dr. Paul Firnhaber at Lincoln Disc and Nutrition here in Lincoln, Nebraska. If you're interested in becoming a patient at our office or having me do an analysis on your blood work or other issues that you may have, our phone number is 402-488-2220. I'll see you next week.